You should never humiliate the woman who is quietly paying for your entire celebration. The laughter started near the grand piano, soft at first, then spreading across the marble ballroom like a ripple through still water. Crystal glasses clinked together beneath a chandelier the size of a small car, casting warm golden light across the Whitmore estate. Now back to the moment that changed everything. Naomi placed her untouched glass onto the nearest table and calmly stepped toward the terrace doors. No anger crossed her face. No embarrassment either. Just a quiet stillness that seemed almost out of place among the laughter behind her. Outside, the ocean breeze brushed against her hair as she reached into her small evening purse and pulled out her phone. The ballroom noise faded behind the thick glass doors. Naomi looked once more through the window at the Whitmore family, raising champagne, toast beneath their towering chandelier. Then she spoke softly into the phone. Delay the transfer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Naomi watched Victoria Whitmore laughing inside the ballroom, still holding the unused napkin. Naomi's voice remained calm. Tonight, they celebrate a deal that does not exist anymore. And inside that bright ballroom filled with powerful people, no one yet realized that the quiet woman they had just mocked was the only person in the world who could make the entire celebration disappear. Inside the ballroom, the laughter slowly faded, but the echo of it still lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Victoria Whitmore lowered the linen napkin when Naomi stepped out onto the terrace, clearly satisfied that the moment had been entertaining enough for her guests. A few investors chuckled quietly and returned to their conversations about market projections and international expansion. The orchestra near the grand staircase resumed playing a soft jazz melody, and waiters moved carefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne glasses. For most of the guests, the moment had already passed. To them, Naomi Carter was simply another consultant who had wandered a little too close to the center of a celebration that did not belong to her. But at the far end of the ballroom, Richard Whitmore had not laughed. The silver-haired founder of Whitmore, Global, stood near the long oak table where the agreement documents rested beneath glass covers. His sharp blue eyes had followed Naomi as she stepped outside. Something about the way she had walked away from the humiliation had felt wrong. Not angry, not embarrassed. Calm. Too calm for someone who had just been mocked in front of 200 powerful people. Richard turned slightly toward his son, Ethan Whitmore, who stood beside him speaking with a group of venture capital partners from New York. Ethan was tall, confident, and already dressed like the future leader of the company his father had built over 4 decades. Nothing. The music continued playing. Guests continued celebrating. Champagne glasses continued clinking beneath the chandeliers. Yet beneath the polished surface of the ballroom, a single quiet crack had begun to form in the foundation of the celebration. Ethan forced a calm smile and dismissed the advisor with a quick nod. I will handle it. But as the young man stepped away, Ethan glanced once more toward the terrace doors where Naomi Carter had stood only minutes earlier. Outside, the ocean wind moved through the palm trees along the cliffside lawn. The terrace now appeared empty. Ethan Whitmore did not know why a small chill moved through his chest at that moment. Inside the ballroom, the Whitmore family continued celebrating a victory they believed was already secured. None of them yet understood that the quiet woman they had mocked only minutes earlier had just set something in motion that could stop the entire deal before the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean the next morning. The terrace was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the ocean far below the cliffs. Naomi Carter stood near the stone railing overlooking the dark Pacific, the wind moving gently through the tall palm trees that lined the edge of the Whitmore estate. From inside the ballroom, the sound of music and laughter still floated through the glass doors behind her, warm and confident, the kind of laughter people share when they believe victory is already theirs. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the cool stone railing and looked out toward the endless black horizon. The city lights of Santa Monica flickered faintly in the distance like small stars scattered along the coastline. She had been to many rooms like the one behind her, rooms filled with polished marble, expensive wine, and people who believed wealth made them untouchable. Yet what she remembered most about those rooms was never the chandeliers, or the champagne. It was the way people looked at her the moment they assumed she did not belong. Tonight had been no different. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment as the ocean breeze brushed across her face, carrying with it the quiet memories that had shaped the woman she had become. She could still picture the small apartment where she grew up on the south side of Chicago. The narrow kitchen where her mother worked late nights preparing meals before leaving for a hospital cleaning shift. The old radio that played soft jazz while Naomi studied at the kitchen table under a flickering lamp. Enter her purse. Inside the ballroom, the celebration continued without hesitation. Champagne glasses still touched together beneath the chandeliers. Music still drifted across the marble floors. Yet Naomi Carter knew something the entire room had not yet discovered. The $5 billion acquisition that everyone inside was celebrating had never truly belonged to the Whitmore family. And before the night was over, they were going to learn exactly who controlled the future of their empire. The music inside the ballroom continued with the smooth confidence of a celebration that believed nothing could go wrong. A soft trumpet carried through the room, while waiters moved gracefully between groups of guests, refilling crystal glasses and collecting empty plates. The marble floor reflected the golden chandelier light above like still water under a summer sunset. Yet beneath that calm surface a quiet tension had begun to spread, subtle but real, like a small crack forming beneath polished stone. Ethan Whitmore stood near the long oak table reviewing the agreement documents again while pretending to listen to a venture partner describing expansion opportunities in Southeast Asia. His expression remained polite, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The message about the delayed funding authorization repeated in his mind. Carter Capital was supposed to have finalized the transfer hours earlier. The acquisition could not move forward without it. Ethan leaned toward the young financial advisor again and lowered his voice. Call the bank directly. Confirm the status. The advisor nodded quickly and stepped away toward the hallway near the service entrance. Ethan forced a confident smile and returned to the conversation, but his eyes kept drifting toward the terrace doors where Naomi Carter had disappeared. On the other side of the room, Richard Whitmore had noticed the same thing. The older man moved slowly through the crowd, greeting guests and accepting congratulations with the calm composure of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating rooms full of powerful people. Yet every few seconds his eyes moved toward the agreement table and then toward the terrace doors beyond it. Something about the evening no longer felt perfectly controlled. Richard had built Whitmore Global through careful decisions and relentless patience. He had survived market crashes, hostile takeovers, and more than one economic downturn that had destroyed competitors twice his size. Instinct had always been his greatest advantage, and that instinct was now whispering that the celebration around him might be moving faster than the reality behind it. Near the center of the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore continued entertaining her circle of social friends, her laughter rising above the music as she described how easily the consultant had been embarrassed earlier in the evening. One of the women beside her leaned closer and asked what Naomi Carter had actually been hired to do. Victoria lifted her glass of champagne and shrugged lightly. Something about acquisition modeling, I think. Ethan said she helped review the numbers for the deal. Nothing important. Just another analyst trying to look intelligent around people who actually run companies. The women around her smiled politely. But younger guest, standing nearby, glanced toward the terrace doors with curiosity. The young woman had recognized Naomi Carter the moment she arrived earlier that evening. She worked at a private equity firm in San Francisco and had seen Naomi present once during a closed investment conference 2 years earlier. At the time, Naomi had spoken for less than 20 minutes about strategic control structures in international mergers. Yet every senior partner in the room had taken notes like students listening to a master lecture. The young woman watched the terrace doors for a moment, considering whether to say something, but the music and laughter of the party quickly carried the conversation in another direction. Across the ballroom, the financial advisor returned to Ethan Whitmore with a slightly pale expression. Ethan stepped aside with him near one of the tall windows overlooking the cliffside lawn. While Ethan asked quietly, the advisor hesitated for a second before answering. Sir, the bank confirmed that the authorization from Carter Capital has not only been delayed, it has been placed on administrative hold. Ethan frowned deeply. Administrative hold by who? The advisor swallowed carefully before answering. They would not say directly, but they did confirm that the instruction came from someone with direct authority over the transfer. For several seconds, Ethan Whitmore said nothing at all. The music continued playing. Guests continued celebrating. But inside his chest, the quiet certainty of the evening had begun to dissolve into something far more dangerous. He looked once more toward the terrace doors. Outside, the dark ocean wind moved through the palm trees under a sky filled with silent stars. Naomi Carter had not returned to the ballroom yet, and for the first time since the celebration began, Ethan Whitmore began to wonder whether the quiet woman his family had mocked earlier might not be as unimportant as everyone had assumed. The ocean wind grew slightly stronger along the terrace, brushing through the tall palm trees and carrying the faint sound of the orchestra from inside the Whitmore estate. Naomi Carter stood quietly near the stone railing, her posture calm, her eyes steady as she looked back through the glass doors into the ballroom. From the outside, the celebration still looked flawless. Guests moved between tables with relaxed confidence, champagne glasses lifted in steady rhythms of congratulation. Laughter continued to rise and fall beneath the golden chandeliers. Yet Naomi could already see the first small signs of uncertainty forming beneath the surface. Inside the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore stepped away from the window where he had spoken with the financial advisor. His expression remained controlled, but the muscles in his jaw had tightened slightly. He moved across the marble floor toward the long oak table where the acquisition documents rested under soft lighting. Richard Whitmore noticed the change immediately. Fathers who build empires often learn to read their sons with the same attention they give to market reports. Richard stepped closer and spoke quietly. Something is wrong. Ethan nodded once. Carter Capital has delayed the funding authorization. Richard said nothing for several seconds. Around them, the music continued, and guests spoke about future expansion, unaware that the foundation beneath their celebration had begun to shift. Richard finally asked a single question. Delayed or canceled? Ethan answered carefully. Delayed for now. Administrative hold. The word administrative sounded harmless to anyone who did not understand how large acquisitions worked. But Richard Whitmore understood. Administrative hold meant that someone with real authority had chosen to stop the transfer. That kind of authority was never random. Richard turned slowly toward the terrace doors. The reflection of the ballroom lights shimmered across the glass like a golden curtain separating two different worlds. Outside, the dark ocean stretched endlessly beyond the cliffside lawn. Naomi Carter was still standing near the railing. She had not moved for several minutes. Richard studied her from across the room. Earlier in the evening, he had barely noticed the quiet consultant his wife had mocked in front of the guests. But now the image of that moment replayed itself in his mind with new clarity. Naomi had not reacted with embarrassment. She had not argued. She had simply walked away with the calm patience of someone who understood something the rest of the room did not. Richard Whitmore had spent 40 years building Whitmore Global by recognizing exactly that kind of calm. He leaned closer to Ethan again. Who exactly recommended her? Ethan hesitated before answering. The advisory group we hired during the early valuation phase. They said she specialized in acquisition structure analysis. Richard kept watching the terrace. Structure analysis. That meant Naomi Carter had spent months studying the architecture of the deal that everyone inside the ballroom was celebrating tonight. He looked again at the oak table where the documents waited under glass. The agreement that would transfer ownership of a powerful technology company to Whitmore Global in the morning depended entirely on the financial backing of Carter Capital. Without that funding, the acquisition would collapse instantly. Ethan followed his father's gaze toward the terrace doors. You think she knows something about the delay? Richard answered quietly. I think we mocked the wrong person tonight. At that moment, a group of investors approached them to offer another round of congratulations. Richard accepted their words politely, but his attention remained divided. Across the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore was still telling her story about the consultant who had not understood her sense of humor. Her friends laughed again, raising their glasses toward the massive banner announcing the acquisition celebration. Yet none of them noticed that the two men who actually controlled Whitmore Global were no longer smiling. Outside the glass doors, Naomi Carter finally turned away from the ocean and walked slowly back toward the ballroom entrance. The terrace lights cast a soft glow across her face as she approached the doors. Inside the estate, the orchestra reached the end of the song, and the final note drifted into silence. In that brief, quiet moment, Naomi Carter opened the door and stepped back into the celebration that was already beginning to unravel. The ballroom doors closed softly behind Naomi Carter as she stepped back inside, and for a brief moment the room seemed to pause without anyone fully understanding why. The orchestra had just finished a song, leaving a pocket of quiet that floated across the marble floor like a held breath. Naomi moved calmly along the edge of the room, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. Several guests glanced at her with mild curiosity, remembering the earlier moment when Victoria Whitmore had handed her the napkin. A few of them expected embarrassment, perhaps a quick exit from the party. But Naomi Carter walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. Near the center of the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore noticed her immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly as she crossed the polished floor beneath the chandelier light. He stepped away from a group of investors and intercepted her path before she reached the terrace doors again. "Naomi Carter," he said with polite formality, his tone calm but firm. "I was hoping to speak with you for a moment." Naomi stopped and turned toward him. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan glanced briefly around the room, aware that many guests were still watching them, perhaps somewhere quieter. Naomi gestured lightly toward a small sitting area near the tall windows that overlooked the dark ocean beyond the cliffs. They walked together across the marble floor, their footsteps echoing softly under the high ceiling. Richard Whitmore watched them from across the room without interrupting. Victoria Whitmore continued speaking with her friends, unaware that the atmosphere of the party had begun to shift around her. Ethan waited until they were seated before speaking again. "I have been informed that the funding authorization from Carter Capital has been delayed." Naomi folded her hands calmly in her lap. "Yes." Ethan studied her carefully. "The delay occurred not long after you stepped outside to make a phone call." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "That is correct." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You understand that the entire acquisition depends on that authorization." Naomi nodded once. "I understand the structure of the deal very well." Ethan allowed a brief silence to pass between them. The distant sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments drifted through the room again. Finally, he spoke more directly. "Did you request the delay?" Naomi answered with the same calm tone she had used all evening. "Yes." Ethan sat back slowly in his chair, processing the answer. A few nearby guests pretended not to listen while clearly doing exactly that. After a moment, Ethan asked the question that had begun forming in his mind the moment he saw her return from the terrace. "On whose authority?" Naomi turned slightly toward the window, where the dark Pacific stretched across, the horizon like a silent witness to the conversation. Then she looked back at him. "On the authority of the party responsible for providing the capital." Ethan felt a small chill move through his chest. Carter Capital is a private investment group with a complex ownership structure. Our advisory team confirmed that weeks ago. Naomi nodded again. "That is correct." Ethan leaned forward once more, his voice lower now. "Then I would appreciate it if you explained why someone within that organization would choose tonight of all nights to delay the funding of a $5 billion acquisition that has already been announced to every major investor in this room." Naomi Carter held his gaze steadily. "Because tonight I discovered something about the Whitmore family that changes how I view this partnership." Ethan frowned slightly. "And what exactly would that be?" Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She simply answered with quiet clarity. "I discovered how easily your family mocks someone they believe has no power in the room." Ethan Whitmore said nothing for several seconds. Across the ballroom, the orchestra began playing again, soft piano notes drifting through the air as guests returned to their conversations. But in the small sitting area near the windows, the temperature of the evening had shifted in a way that could no longer be ignored. Naomi Carter rose slowly from her chair and looked down at Ethan Whitmore with the same calm composure she had carried since the moment she arrived. "The question now, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "is whether your family still believes I have no power in this room tonight." The quiet words Naomi Carter had just spoken seemed to linger in the air long after she finished them. Ethan Whitmore remained seated for a moment, his mind moving quickly through the implications of what he had just heard. Around them the party continued with forced elegance. The orchestra had shifted into a slower melody, and guests once again raised their glasses, but the small circle near the window had grown noticeably quieter. A few investors standing nearby pretended to focus on their conversations while clearly listening to every word that passed between Naomi and Ethan. Naomi did not rush away after standing from the chair. She remained there calmly, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady as she watched Ethan consider his response. Finally, he rose from the chair and spoke again, this time with less certainty in his voice than before. "Miss Carter, delaying a funding transfer of this size is not a small matter. This acquisition involves hundreds of employees and a great many investors." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that statement. "I am aware of the scale of the decision." Ethan lowered his voice slightly. "Then perhaps you should also be aware that intentionally interfering with a corporate transaction could expose someone to serious legal consequences." Naomi did not react with offense. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying Ethan the way a strategist studies a chessboard before making the next move. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "but you are assuming I interfered with something that belonged to your company." Ethan frowned at the phrasing. Across the room, Richard Whitmore had now moved closer, his instincts guiding him toward the conversation unfolding near the window. The older man approached slowly, greeting guests along the way, so his movement did not appear unusual. Victoria Whitmore remained unaware of the shift in the atmosphere. She was now describing vacation plans to a pair of social friends who laughed easily at every sentence. Ethan spoke again, choosing his words carefully. "Carter Capital agreed to provide the financial backing for this acquisition after months of negotiation. That agreement allowed Whitmore Global to announce the deal publicly." Naomi replied with the same calm tone she had used all evening. "Yes, it did." Ethan gestured toward the oak table where the acquisition documents waited beneath glass covers. "And now the authorization for that funding has been delayed without warning only hours before the final signing." Naomi turned her head slightly toward the documents. The structure of that agreement gave Carter Capital the right to pause the transfer until the final moment before signing if circumstances changed. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Circumstances?" Naomi met his gaze again. "Circumstances such as discovering that the leadership of Whitmore Global does not treat potential partners with respect." At that moment, Richard Whitmore reached them. Ethan stepped slightly aside as his father joined the conversation. Richard studied Naomi Carter carefully before speaking. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had negotiated billions of dollars in deals over a lifetime. "Miss Carter, I believe my son and I would both appreciate clarity about your role in this situation." Naomi inclined her head politely toward him. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Richard continued, "Are you suggesting that the decision to delay the funding came directly from you?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Yes." Richard remained silent for several seconds, measuring the weight of that statement. Around them, the party continued, but the circle of quiet around their conversation grew slightly larger as more guests began sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Finally, Richard asked the question that now mattered more than anything else in the room. "In what position within Carter Capital gives you the authority to make that decision?" Naomi Carter looked from father to son with steady composure. Then she spoke with the calm certainty of someone revealing a truth that could no longer remain hidden. "The position that allows me to make that decision is the one that holds controlling interest in the firm." For a moment, Ethan Whitmore thought he had misunderstood the sentence. Richard Whitmore, however, did not look surprised. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi as the full implication of her words settled into the silence between them. Across the ballroom, the orchestra continued playing softly. Guests laughed and raised their glasses again, unaware that the foundation of the $5 billion celebration was beginning to shift beneath their feet. For several seconds after Naomi Carter finished speaking, the air between the three of them remained perfectly still. The quiet claim that she held controlling interest in Carter Capital did not sound dramatic when she said it. There was no raised voice and no attempt to impress anyone nearby. Yet the effect of those words moved through Richard Whitmore and his son like a sudden drop in temperature. Ethan Whitmore was the first to respond, although his voice carried far less confidence than it had only minutes earlier. "That is not possible," he said quietly. "Carter Capital is structured through layered investment trusts." Naomi nodded once. "That is correct." Ethan continued speaking, almost as if explaining the situation to himself rather than to her. "Our advisory team reviewed the ownership structure thoroughly. The controlling shares are distributed through multiple holding groups." Naomi listened patiently while he spoke. When he finished, she replied with calm precision. "Those holding groups belong to the same private trust." Ethan frowned. "And that trust belongs to whom?" Naomi answered simply, "To me." The orchestra continued playing in the background, but the music now sounded distant and strangely hollow in Ethan Whitmore's ears. He glanced toward the oak table where the acquisition documents rested under glass. Only a short time earlier, that table had represented the most confident moment of his career. Investors had flown across the country to celebrate the expansion of Whitmore Global into a new technology sector that would double the company's valuation within a decade. Yet every projection for that future depended entirely on the capital transfer authorized by Carter Capital. And according to the woman standing calmly in front of him, that capital now belonged to her. Richard Whitmore had not interrupted during this exchange. The older man watched Naomi Carter with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between arrogance and quiet certainty. He had spent decades across negotiating tables with men who pretended to hold power they did not actually possess. Naomi Carter did not feel like one of those people. Richard finally spoke. "If what you are saying is true, then the delay we are experiencing tonight was not caused by an internal administrative review." Naomi met his gaze. "No, Mr. Whitmore. It was caused by a decision." Richard nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "A decision based on the conversation earlier this evening." Naomi did not rush to answer. She allowed a brief silence to pass while the distant sound of glasses clinking carried across the ballroom. Then she replied calmly, "Partly." Ethan looked confused. "Partly." Naomi turned slightly toward the glass wall, where the dark Pacific Ocean stretched across the horizon beyond the cliffside lawn. "Your family mocking me tonight did not change the structure of the deal. That structure was already in place long before I arrived here this evening." Ethan studied her carefully. "Then why delay the funding?" Naomi returned her attention to him. "Because tonight I learned something important about the people I would be trusting with that capital." Richard Whitmore folded his arms as he listened. Naomi continued speaking with steady clarity. "When partnerships of this size are formed, the most valuable asset is not the technology being purchased or the numbers written inside the contract. It is trust." She paused briefly before continuing. "Earlier tonight, your family showed me how quickly you dismiss someone when you believe they do not belong in the room." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi raised one hand gently, not to silence him, but to complete the thought. "A company that controls billions of dollars in assets must choose its partners carefully. And tonight I needed to decide whether Whitmore Global is the kind of partner I am willing to trust with that responsibility." For the first time since the conversation began, Ethan Whitmore had no immediate answer. Across the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore laughed loudly again as she raised another glass of champagne with her friends. None of them had noticed the quiet storm forming only a few yards away. But Richard Whitmore had noticed everything. And as he watched Naomi Carter standing calmly before him, he realized that the woman his family had mocked earlier in the evening might be the single person in the room whose decision would determine whether their $5 billion celebration ended in triumph or humiliation. The silence that followed Naomi Carter's explanation stretched longer than anyone in the ballroom could see. From a distance, the three figures near the tall windows looked like nothing more than another quiet conversation among powerful people. The orchestra continued playing a smooth melody. Waiters passed through the crowd, carrying silver trays. Champagne glasses touched together beneath the warm chandelier light. Yet inside that small circle near the window, the energy of the evening had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Ethan Whitmore slowly ran a hand across his jaw as he processed everything Naomi had just said. The idea that the quiet consultant his mother had mocked earlier could actually control the capital behind their $5 billion acquisition still felt impossible to him. But another part of his mind had already begun assembling the evidence. The delayed transfer. The calm phone call she had made outside. The fact that she had never once seemed nervous in a room filled with billionaires. Ethan finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried a different tone. Less authority, more caution. If what you're saying is accurate, then Carter Capital did not simply evaluate this deal from the outside. You designed its structure. Naomi gave a small nod. My team and I spent nearly 8 months analyzing the acquisition proposal before agreeing to provide funding. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle over him. 8 months meant Naomi Carter had studied every detail of Whitmore Global long before anyone in his family had even met her. Richard Whitmore, meanwhile, continued watching her with the quiet focus of a man who had spent decades studying competitors and partners alike. He spoke slowly. Miss Carter, people who hold controlling interest in an investment firm worth billions rarely attend corporate celebrations alone. Naomi replied calmly. I rarely attend them at all. Richard studied her expression carefully. Then why attend this one? Naomi glanced briefly across the ballroom. Victoria Whitmore was still laughing with her circle of friends, describing the earlier moment when she had handed Naomi the napkin. A few guests nearby laughed politely, though their attention had begun drifting toward the quiet conversation unfolding near the window. Naomi returned her attention to Richard. Because I want to see how Whitmore Global behaves when no one believes the real decision maker is in the room. Ethan looked genuinely unsettled now. That was a test. Naomi answered simply, yes. Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds as the meaning of that answer settled in his mind. He had built his company by evaluating people carefully before trusting them with responsibility. Now he realized that Naomi Carter had been evaluating his family with the same precision. Richard finally spoke again. And based on what you observed tonight, you are reconsidering the partnership. Naomi nodded once. Respect and judgment matter in business decisions at this level. The way a company treats someone it believes is powerless often reveals how it will treat its partners once contracts are signed. Ethan looked toward the oak table where the acquisition documents waited under glass. The massive banner above the ballroom still announced the celebration of their $5 billion expansion. Investors continued congratulating one another across the room. None of them yet realized that the most important decision of the entire night was happening quietly near a window overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Ethan turned back toward Naomi. If the delay was meant as a warning, then you have made your point. The question now is whether the deal can still move forward. Naomi did not answer immediately. She watched the crowd in the ballroom for a moment as laughter rose again from the group surrounding Victoria Whitmore. Finally, she spoke with the same steady calm she had carried all evening. That depends on whether the leadership of Whitmore Global understands the difference between power and arrogance. Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly. The older man understood negotiations well enough to recognize the moment when a deal stood on the edge of survival. He looked directly at Naomi Carter. Then perhaps the next step is for you to explain exactly what you need to see from us before the capital transfer is released. Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. The quiet decision she had been weighing since stepping back into the ballroom was now reaching its conclusion. Across the estate, the waves of the Pacific continued rolling toward the cliffs in slow, endless rhythm. And somewhere between the sound of that distant ocean and the soft music inside the ballroom, Naomi Carter prepared to decide whether the Whitmore family would keep their $5 billion future or watch it disappear before sunrise. For a long moment after Richard Whitmore asked his question, the only sound near the tall windows was the distant music drifting through the ballroom and the faint rhythm of ocean waves striking the cliffs below the estate. Naomi Carter did not answer immediately. She looked across the room again at the celebration that had begun hours earlier with such certainty. The golden chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floor. Guests continued congratulating one another while the orchestra played another smooth melody. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet Naomi knew that one quiet decision would soon determine whether the entire evening would be remembered as a triumph or a humiliation. She turned her attention back to Richard Whitmore. "What I need to see is not complicated," she said calmly. "I need to see whether the leadership of Whitmore Global understands that power does not come from the size of a company or the value of contract. It comes from judgment." Ethan Whitmore remained silent beside his father. Earlier in the evening, he had spoken with the confidence of someone certain that the deal had already been secured. Now he understood that the real negotiation had only just begun. Richard Whitmore studied Naomi carefully before replying. "Judgment is something my company has relied on for more than 40 years. Naomi nodded slightly. "Then you also understand that judgment begins with respect." Richard did not deny the point. Across the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore raised her voice again as she finished another story about the consultant she had embarrassed earlier in the evening. Several guests laughed politely. One of them glanced uneasily toward the conversation near the window, sensing that the mood of the room was slowly changing. Naomi continued speaking quietly. "When I walked into this ballroom tonight, no one here believed I had any influence over the outcome of this deal. Your family made that assumption very clear." Ethan lowered his gaze briefly. Naomi went on. "In many situations, that assumption would not matter. But when a partnership involves billions of dollars, assumptions become dangerous." Richard Whitmore folded his arms as he listened. Naomi Carter was not speaking with anger. She was explaining the situation with the calm clarity of someone who had already measured every possible outcome. Finally, Richard asked a question that carried the weight of the entire evening. "If my family misjudged you tonight, what exactly do you expect us to do about it?" Naomi did not hesitate. "A partnership of this scale requires leaders who understand when they are wrong." She turned slightly toward the center of the ballroom, where Victoria Whitmore still stood laughing with her friends beneath the bright chandelier light. Then she looked back at Richard. "The person who created the humiliation tonight should acknowledge it publicly." Ethan Whitmore looked up quickly. "You want an apology?" Naomi answered with quiet precision. "I want evidence that Whitmore Global knows how to correct a mistake when it becomes clear." Richard Whitmore did not respond right away. The request itself was simple, but the setting made it complicated. A public acknowledgement in front of the very guests who had witnessed the earlier mockery would transform the entire tone of the celebration. Across the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore raised another glass of champagne while her friends laughed again. She still had no idea that the future of the $5 billion acquisition now depended entirely on the next few minutes. Richard Whitmore looked toward his son and then back at Naomi Carter. In that moment, he understood something that many powerful people learn too late. Pride could destroy a deal faster than any competitor. The older man finally spoke with quiet determination. "If correcting that mistake is what it takes to restore this partnership, then it will be done." Ethan Whitmore watched his father carefully. The decision was not comfortable, but it was necessary. Richard turned his eyes toward the center of the ballroom, where Victoria Whitmore stood. The music continued playing and guests continued celebrating. Yet the moment that would decide whether the night ended in triumph or disaster was about to begin. Richard Whitmore did not rush toward the center of the ballroom. A man who had spent 4 decades negotiating billion-dollar agreements understood that moments like this had to be handled with calm control. The orchestra continued, playing softly while guests talked and laughed beneath the golden chandeliers. unaware that the direction of the entire evening was about to change. Richard Whitmore stepped away from the window and walked slowly across the marble floor. Ethan followed beside him, his expression serious now, the earlier confidence replaced by careful focus. Naomi Carter remained near the tall windows, watching quietly as the two men approached the center of the room. Conversations slowly quieted as guests noticed the founder of Whitmore Global moving toward the middle of the ballroom. When Richard Whitmore lifted his hand, the orchestra gradually lowered their instruments and the music faded into silence. 200 guests turned their attention toward him. Many of them expected another toast celebrating the acquisition that everyone believed would be finalized in the morning. Richard Whitmore stood beneath the largest chandelier and looked across the room for a moment before speaking. His voice carried clearly through the ballroom without effort. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining my family tonight. This evening we gathered to celebrate a partnership that represents the future growth of Whitmore Global. Several guests raised their glasses in agreement, assuming the familiar speech would continue. But Richard Whitmore paused. His eyes moved briefly toward Naomi Carter, standing quietly near the tall windows. Then he continued speaking in a tone that was calm, but noticeably more serious. Before this celebration goes any further, there is something important that must be addressed. The room grew quieter. Victoria Whitmore lowered her champagne glass slightly as she turned toward her husband with mild confusion. Richard continued, "Earlier tonight, my family made a mistake." A few guests shifted in place, sensing that the direction of the speech had suddenly changed. Richard spoke with steady clarity. A guest in this room was treated with disrespect because we assumed she had no authority in the decisions being made here tonight. Victoria Whitmore blinked in surprise. Several people nearby looked toward Naomi Carter, beginning to understand what Richard was referring to. Richard did not look away from the audience. In business and in life, assumptions can lead to serious errors in judgment. When those errors occur, the responsible thing to do is correct them immediately. The silence across the ballroom deepened. Richard Whitmore then did something very few powerful people ever do in front of a room filled with investors and political allies. He turned toward Naomi Carter and spoke directly to her. "Miss Carter, on behalf of my family, I would like to apologize for the way you were treated earlier this evening." The words echoed across the marble floor. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the guests. Victoria Whitmore looked stunned. She had expected many things from her husband during this celebration, but never a public apology. Richard continued speaking without hesitation. "Your expertise and your role in this partnership deserve respect. Failing to recognize that earlier was our mistake." Ethan Whitmore stepped forward slightly beside his father. His voice followed with calm sincerity. "Miss Carter, I also apologize for not correcting that situation immediately when it occurred." The room remained silent as every guest watched Naomi Carter. The woman who had stood quietly near the edges of the celebration earlier was now the center of attention in a ballroom filled with some of the most influential people in the country. Naomi did not react with triumph or anger. She simply walked slowly across the marble floor toward Richard Whitmore. The sound of her footsteps was soft but unmistakable in the silent room. When she stopped a few feet from him, she looked at Richard and then at Ethan. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire ballroom waited to see whether the apology had come too late to save the partnership that everyone had gathered to celebrate. For several seconds after Naomi Carter stopped in front of Richard Whitmore, the entire ballroom remained silent. The chandeliers glowed above the marble floor, and every guest watched the quiet exchange unfolding in the center of the room. Naomi looked first at Richard Whitmore and then at Ethan Whitmore beside him. Neither man looked away. The apology had been sincere and public, and in a room filled with investors and executives, that kind of admission carried real weight. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, but clear enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Mr. Whitmore, your willingness to correct a mistake in front of your peers shows more leadership than many executives demonstrate in private." A subtle wave of relief moved through several investors who had been listening carefully. Richard Whitmore nodded slightly. "Thank you, Miss Carter. Naomi continued, still composed, still steady. But the decision I made tonight was never only about an apology. A partnership involving billions of dollars requires more than correcting a single moment of disrespect. It requires confidence in the people who will control the outcome of that partnership for years to come. Ethan Whitmore listened closely, his posture straight, aware that every sentence Naomi spoke might determine whether the acquisition survived the night. Naomi turned slightly so that more of the guests could hear her. Carter Capital spent many months reviewing the proposal presented by Whitmore Global. During that process, my team studied your company carefully. Your financial structure, your leadership decisions, and the reputation of your organization in every market where you operate. Several investors exchanged quiet glances. Naomi Carter was no longer just a consultant standing near the edge of the celebration. She was now speaking as the controlling authority behind the capital that made the entire deal possible. Naomi continued speaking. We believed this acquisition had the potential to create real innovation and growth. That is why Carter Capital agreed to fund it. Richard Whitmore listened without interrupting. Naomi then paused for a brief moment before finishing the thought. But partnerships are not based only on opportunity. They're based on trust. And tonight that trust was tested. The room remained silent. Naomi looked toward the long oak table where the agreement documents rested beneath glass. Then she reached into her purse and removed her phone. The small screen glowed softly in the light of the chandelier as she opened a message window. Ethan Whitmore watched carefully. Naomi spoke again. Earlier tonight, I placed the funding authorization on hold. That decision stopped the transfer that would finalize the acquisition tomorrow morning. The guests already knew that much from the earlier conversation, but hearing it confirmed publicly made the stakes of the moment even clearer. Naomi looked back toward Richard Whitmore. Your apology tonight demonstrated that Whitmore Global understands the importance of accountability. That matters to me. Richard waited without speaking. Naomi glanced down at her phone again, then continued calmly. But leadership is not measured only by one moment of correction. It is measured by whether the values behind that correction are real. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the room full of investors who had gathered to celebrate the $5 billion partnership. Tonight, every person here witnessed how quickly assumptions can shape the way people treat one another. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Naomi finally finished speaking. Because of that, I need to make a final decision about whether Carter Capital will continue supporting this acquisition. Ethan Whitmore felt the tension return to his chest as the entire ballroom waited for the conclusion of her sentence. Naomi Carter looked once more at the Whitmore family standing before her. Then she spoke the words that would determine the future of the deal. After considering everything that happened tonight, I have decided that Carter Capital will release the funding authorization. A quiet wave of relief moved through the crowd. Naomi lowered her phone slowly and added one final sentence. But understand this clearly. Respect is not a courtesy in partnerships like this. It is a requirement. And if that requirement is ever forgotten again, Carter Capital will not hesitate to withdraw its support no matter how large the contract may be. For a moment after Naomi Carter announced that the funding authorization would be released, the ballroom remained completely still, as if the entire room needed time to breathe again. Then the tension that had quietly gripped the celebration began to loosen. A few investors exhaled softly. Someone near the orchestra whispered something relieved to a colleague. The musicians slowly resumed their melody, and the gentle sound of piano drifted back into the air. Yet the atmosphere of the party had changed in a way that could never return to what it had been earlier in the evening. Naomi Carter lowered her phone and placed it calmly back into her purse. Across the room, the guests, who had once barely noticed her, now watched with a very different kind of attention. Richard Whitmore stepped forward and extended his hand toward her with genuine respect. Miss Carter, thank you for giving this partnership the opportunity to continue. Naomi accepted the handshake with quiet composure. Partnerships survive when people are willing to learn from mistakes, she replied calmly. Ethan Whitmore stood beside his father and nodded. Tonight we learned something important. Naomi glanced briefly across the ballroom, where Victoria Whitmore remained standing with her friends. The earlier confidence in Victoria's expression had faded. She had heard every word of the conversation that had followed her careless mockery. For the first time that evening, she walked slowly across the marble floor toward Naomi Carter. The guests nearest to them stepped aside slightly, sensing that another moment of honesty was about to unfold. Victoria Whitmore stopped in front of Naomi and spoke quietly, though the nearby crowd could still hear her words. "Miss Carter, I owe you my own apology. My comment earlier tonight was disrespectful and unnecessary." Naomi studied her expression for a moment. Victoria did not look defensive now. She looked humbled in a way that only public mistakes can create. Naomi gave a small nod. Acknowledging a mistake is never easy in a room like this. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. "Then I am glad it happened tonight, instead of after the deal was signed." Naomi allowed the faintest hint of a smile. That is one way to look at it. Around them, the celebration slowly returned to life, but the laughter now carried a quieter tone. Conversations had shifted. Guests no longer spoke about the acquisition as if it were simply another corporate victory. They spoke about the woman who had walked into a ballroom full of billionaires and calmly reminded them that respect carries more value than arrogance. A short time later, the orchestra played a final piece while guests began preparing to leave the estate. The night air outside was cool, and the distant Pacific waves continued rolling against the cliffs beneath the property. Naomi Carter stepped onto the terrace once more before leaving. The same ocean breeze moved through the palm trees as earlier, but the night felt very different now. Behind her, the Whitmore family stood together near the entrance, speaking quietly with several investors. Richard Whitmore looked across the terrace and raised his hand in a small gesture of gratitude. Naomi returned the nod before walking toward the path that led down the long driveway. As the lights of the estate glowed behind her, she reflected briefly on the lesson that had shaped the entire evening. Wealth can fill a room with power and influence, but character is what determines who truly deserves to stand there. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who holds the future of everyone else in their hands.